The sun was bright that morning, and the city of London looked like a place straight out of a picture book. The streets were filled with people from many different countries. Families walked together, friends laughed, and children pointed at the large buildings. Among these people was a group of tourists who had come from far away. They were excited because this was their first visit to London, and they wanted to see every famous landmark. Their cameras were ready, their phones fully charged, and their voices were loud with excitement. When they turned a corner near Buckingham Palace, their eyes lit up. There stood the royal guards, tall and silent, dressed in their famous red uniforms and black hats. Next to them were the large, strong horses, their shiny coats gleaming in the sunlight. The scene was something out of history, something that had lasted for hundreds of years, and the tourists could not believe they were seeing it with their own eyes. They quickly ran closer, pushing each other for the best view. At first, they looked with respect. They took pictures, whispered to one another about how serious the guards looked, and admired the horses. But soon their excitement became louder than their respect. Some of them started to laugh too loudly. One of the tourists, a young man with a bright blue jacket, pulled out his phone and stepped far too close to one of the horses. He wanted a picture that would stand out from everyone else's. His friends cheered him on, telling him to smile big and pretend he was holding the horse's reins. He laughed and stretched out his hand, ignoring the clear sign near the gate that said, "Do not touch the guards or horses." The tourists thought the signs were only warnings for children or people who did not know better. They believed it was only for fun. To them, the guards looked like actors standing still for the sake of photographs. The horses looked calm, their eyes half closed, and this gave the tourists false courage. Another member of the group, a woman with a large hat, clapped her hands loudly to make one of the horses raise its head. When the animal did, she squealed and laughed as though it was part of a show. Other visitors nearby were shocked. They shook their heads and frowned at the group's behavior. Many people knew the importance of the royal guards. They were not there for entertainment. They were trained soldiers serving a serious role. The horses were not for amusement either. They were well-trained animals that responded to discipline and respect. But the foolish tourists did not think about these things. They were more focused on their own laughter and the photos they wanted to post online. The guards themselves stood motionless. Their eyes remained fixed straight ahead, and they gave no reaction to the noise or the movement. Their stillness made the tourists believe that nothing would happen, that they could do as they pleased. This false belief made them even more careless. One of them leaned against the gate, calling to another to stand closer so he could get a better shot. They treated the place like a playground, and their voices grew louder than the respectful silence of the crowd around them. The air began to change. A few children in the crowd pulled their parents' hands and asked why those people were acting so silly. Some parents explained softly that the guards and horses were not there for fun, and that the group should step back. But the tourists did not listen. They were lost in their own excitement, not noticing how uncomfortable they were making everyone else feel. One of the horses stamped its hoof on the stone ground. The sound was sharp and echoed around the open space. Some people in the crowd stiffened at the noise, but the tourists only laughed more. They thought the horse was simply restless, not realizing it was reacting to the irritation being caused. The horse's ears twitched back, its head moved slightly, and its nostrils flared. The signs were clear to anyone who understood animals, but the tourists were blind to it. Another horse shifted suddenly, tossing its head and letting out a loud breath. The woman with the big hat shrieked, first in surprise and then in laughter, as though it was the best part of her holiday. She did not see the way the guard sitting tall in the saddle kept a firm grip on the reins, his jaw set and his eyes forward. His training told him not to break discipline, but his posture grew tenser with each second. The group continued their careless games. They tried to make funny faces next to the horses, clapped to get reactions, and ignored the looks of disapproval from the rest of the visitors. To them, it felt like a joke, a harmless moment to brag about later. But in truth, they were walking closer and closer to the edge of a mistake they would not forget. As the minutes passed, the sun reflected off the palace gates, and the horses' coats glimmered. The scene was beautiful, but under the surface there was a growing sense of tension. The tourists did not feel it, but the others did. The guard's silence seemed heavier, the animals' movements sharper. People in the crowd began pulling out their phones, not only to take pictures but to record what they sensed might happen. A few even whispered to one another, saying that these visitors were about to get what they deserved. The group was too busy with themselves to notice. They were laughing, clapping, and moving closer than they should have. The sound of their voices grew louder, breaking the peaceful atmosphere that surrounded the royal guard. The dignity of the place, which had impressed so many other visitors, was being treated like a stage for childish games. Little did the tourists know, their behavior was not only foolish but dangerous. The guards' discipline was legendary, but the horses were living creatures, not statues. They were trained to react strongly to protect themselves and their riders. The group's arrogance was slowly waking that instinct. Each careless movement, each loud laugh was pushing the animals closer to a reaction. The crowd waited in suspense, their eyes wide and their cameras ready. Everyone except the group seemed to understand what was about to come. The tourists believed they were in control, but in truth they were standing on the edge of a lesson they were about to learn the hard way. The foolish group of tourists did not stop after their first silly tricks. Their excitement only grew when they saw that the guards did not move or say anything. In their minds, this silence was proof that nothing serious could happen. They thought the guards were just actors standing still for the amusement of the public. They also believed the horses were calm creatures that would never react. Because of this wrong belief, they felt free to push their limits. One man from the group, wearing a red scarf, raised his phone high above his head and called loudly to his friends. He told them to gather closer to the horses so they could all fit into one picture. His friends giggled and hurried to join him. Soon, 6 of them were pressed close to the iron gate, leaning their bodies forward to make the photograph look funny. They stuck out their tongues, made silly faces, and laughed as the camera clicked. Behind them, the large horse snorted, its ears turning back. A few people in the crowd gasped, but the group only looked back for a second before laughing again. The noise grew worse. The woman with the large hat clapped her hands again, this time louder than before. She wanted the horse to look at her phone for a perfect shot. She did not understand that clapping near a trained horse could be taken as a challenge or a command. The horse shifted its feet and stamped again, harder this time, but she only clapped faster, thinking it was a game. The horse's tail swished sharply through the air, hitting the side of its body with a loud thump. Nearby children looked nervous. A little boy tugged at his father's sleeve and asked in a quiet voice why those people were bothering the animals. The father bent down and whispered that the group was being rude and that it was not safe. The boy's wide eyes showed that he understood better than the adults who were misbehaving. Even strangers who had no connection to the palace could see that this was wrong. Another tourist from the group stepped forward, reaching his arm toward the reins of the horse. He wanted to touch it just for a second, so he could tell people back home that he had touched a royal guard's horse. His fingers stretched out, trembling with excitement, but before they could reach the leather strap, the horse's head jerked away with sudden strength. The movement startled him and he quickly pulled his hand back, but his friends exploded with laughter, making the moment feel like a comedy act instead of a warning. The guards remained frozen in place, their discipline unshaken. Their eyes looked ahead, their bodies unmoved as though carved from stone, but anyone who paid close attention could see the tiny details. A guard's grip on the reins tightened slightly. Another adjusted his posture in the saddle. They were trained not to break their silence unless it was truly necessary, but they were fully aware of what was happening. Their job was not only to guard the palace, but also to keep order and protect their horses. More people in the crowd began pulling out their phones. Some wanted to capture the beauty of the guards and horses, but others now wanted to record the foolishness of the tourists. The group had become the center of attention, but not in the way they hoped. Murmurs ran through the crowd. Some shook their heads, some whispered about the disrespect being shown, and others waited to see what would happen next. The tourists, however, noticed none of this. They were caught up in their own amusement, blind to the disapproval around them. They called out jokes, laughed at their own daring behavior, and ignored the clear signs that warned them not to touch or disturb the guards and horses. One of them even joked that the guards were robots because no human could stand so still. His friends roared with laughter at the idea, while the crowd grew more tense. The atmosphere changed once more when the woman with the big hat pulled out a snack from her bag. She waved it in the air, pretending to offer it to one of the horses. "Do you want a bite?" she said in a mocking voice, laughing with her friends. The horse raised its head high, letting out a loud sound through its nose. Its muscles tensed and it shifted forward a few steps. The people in the crowd gasped loudly, and several parents pulled their children back to safety. The foolish woman only laughed harder. not realizing how close she was to serious danger. She thought the horse's reaction was funny, not understanding that the animal was warning her to back away. Another horse beside it tossed its head too, its bridle jingling with the sudden movement. The noise rang sharp in the air like a bell of warning that most people understood immediately. Finally, a palace security officer stepped closer from the side. He raised his arm and motioned for the group to step back. His face was stern and his eyes serious. He did not want to break the peaceful order of the place, but it was his duty to maintain respect and safety. He spoke firmly, telling them to move away from the guards and animals. The group only half listened. A couple of them shuffled backward a step, but then one man laughed and said loudly that they were only having fun. He waved at the officer dismissively and turned back toward the horses again. His friends cheered at his boldness, and one even clapped him on the shoulder. They thought they were proving their courage, when in reality, they were only proving their ignorance. The officer narrowed his eyes, but he did not push further yet. He trusted that the guards and horses would make their point soon enough. The crowd held its breath, waiting for what would come next. The tension was like a string pulled tight, ready to snap at any moment. The tourists continued their foolish behavior. They leaned too close to the horses, laughed too loudly, and ignored every warning sign around them. Their actions grew bolder, their voices carried farther, and their laughter echoed against the palace walls. To them, it was the highlight of their trip. To everyone else, it was the height of disrespect. What they did not know was that the calm surface was about to break. The horses, powerful and disciplined, had limits. The guards, silent and unshaken, had patience, but that patience was not endless. Each passing second brought the group closer to a moment they would never forget. The sunlight shone brighter as the minutes dragged on. The air seemed heavier, filled with the mixture of laughter from the group and the uneasy silence of the crowd. The foolish tourists believed they were untouchable, that their fun would last forever. But beneath the stillness of the guards and the strength of the horses, something was building, something ready to remind them of the respect they had forgotten. The street near the palace had grown strangely silent except for the noise of the foolish group. Their loud voices filled the air, but behind those voices was a quiet tension that everyone else in the crowd could feel. The guards stood as still as stone, their tall hats unmoving, their hands steady on the reins. The horses shifted slightly, their muscles tightening under the heavy saddles. The power of these animals was clear to anyone who paid attention. Their strong legs, their deep chests, and their sharp eyes told the truth. They were not decorations. They were trained partners of soldiers. One of the horses let out a sudden snort, so loud that it startled a few children in the crowd. Its ears moved back flat against its head, and it stamped the ground hard enough that the sound echoed across the open space. The group of tourists stopped laughing for only a moment. Then one of them shouted something silly and they all laughed again. They still believed it was just part of the act, that the animals were harmless and the guards would never break their silence. The truth was far different. The guards were trained not to react unless they needed to, but their horses were alive and no amount of training could erase the instincts of such strong creatures. These were not small animals that could be pushed around. They were tall, heavy, and full of strength. They could sense disrespect and they could sense danger. And at that moment they sensed both. One man from the group leaned forward again, holding his phone close to the horse's face to capture what he thought would be a funny video. The horse raised its head high, its nostrils flaring. Suddenly it blew out a loud, sharp breath, so forceful that the man's scarf flew backward over his shoulder. He stumbled a step, but his friends burst into laughter, treating the moment like a comedy show. The man laughed too, though his eyes showed a flash of nervousness he tried to hide. The other horse shifted its weight and stepped sideways. The heavy sound of its hoof hitting the ground made some of the crowd step back. The woman with the large hat clapped again, thinking it would make the horse do another trick. Instead, the animal jerked its head sharply to the side, nearly hitting the gate. Its bridle jingled with the force and its tail whipped through the air. The people watching gasped, their voices rising in shock. Cameras went up higher, recording every moment. The group of tourists finally began to notice that the reaction they were getting was no longer amusing. The horses looked different now. Their calm expressions had been replaced with restless energy. They tossed their heads, their ears pinned back, their nostrils wide. It was clear to everyone in the crowd that the animals were warning the group to stop. But the group was still too foolish, still too caught in their own pride to fully understand. Then it happened. The first horse suddenly stomped both front hooves in quick succession, the sound like thunder against the stone. Its head rose high, its mouth opening as it let out a powerful sound that echoed across the square. The tourists jumped back, their eyes wide with shock. The man with the red scarf almost dropped his phone. The woman with the big hat shrieked, stumbling into her friend's shoulder. Their laughter was gone now. It had been replaced by the realization that the animals were not playthings. The second horse joined in, tossing its head so violently that the bridle rattled. It snorted and stamped, pulling slightly against the reins held firmly by the guard. The crowd let out another loud gasp. Parents pulled their children even farther back. Some people covered their mouths, waiting to see what would happen next. The guards did not move, but their presence felt stronger now. Their silence was no longer taken as weakness. Instead, it felt like power, a power that held control even when the animals beneath them were showing their strength. The guards' discipline only made the reaction of the horses seem more dramatic. The message was clear to everyone watching. The guards would not break their calm, but the horses were not to be tested. The foolish group's faces turned pale. Their earlier smiles were gone. They looked at one another nervously, their bodies shifting closer together as though the crowd around them might protect them. But the crowd offered no comfort. Many people were filming, their cameras capturing every second. Others shook their heads in disbelief, whispering about how the group had brought this on themselves. The man with the phone took a shaky step back, holding his hands up as though trying to calm the animal. His scarf fluttered in the breeze, and his earlier bravado seemed to vanish. The woman with the large hat pulled it down over her face, hiding her expression. Another member of the group muttered something about leaving, but his words were drowned out by the sound of the horse stamping again. The air felt heavy with tension. The crowd had gone almost silent, waiting. It was as if the entire square was holding its breath. The only sounds were the restless movements of the horses, the clinking of metal from their bridles, and the occasional nervous shuffle of feet from the tourists. The situation had turned from amusement to warning, from foolish laughter to the edge of fear. One of the tourists finally spoke up, his voice trembling. He suggested they should step back before things got worse, but another tried to laugh it off, though his laughter was forced and weak. He said the animals were only playing, that nothing serious would happen. His words rang hollow even to his own friends. The truth was written in the way their hands shook, in the way their eyes darted nervously toward the powerful animals in front of them. The guards remained still, their discipline unshaken. But behind their stillness was authority. If the group pushed even a little further, there would be no more warnings. The guards had the right to act if necessary, and the crowd knew it. The tourists seemed to finally understand too, though far too late. The horses moved again, tossing their heads and stamping with such force that dust rose from the ground. The animals' breaths came out in loud, sharp bursts, fogging the air in front of them. Their muscles rippled beneath their coats, and their powerful bodies looked ready to spring. The group stumbled backward a few steps, their foolish confidence crumbling away. The crowd began to murmur again, voices low but filled with judgment. Everyone knew the tourists had gone too far. They had ignored the signs, ignored the warnings, and ignored the respect owed to both the guards and their horses. Now they were facing the consequences, and the world was watching. The woman with the hat pulled on her friend's arm, urging him to leave. The man with the phone lowered it slowly, his hands trembling. Another held up his palms toward the horse as though to show he meant no harm. Their earlier bravado had completely vanished. Instead of standing tall and laughing, they now looked small and uncertain, their arrogance crushed by the simple power of the animals. The square was no longer filled with laughter. It was filled with silence, the kind of silence that comes when people realize they are standing too close to something they do not understand. The crowd continued to watch, their phones capturing the moment that the tourists finally began to regret their actions. What had started as a game was no longer fun. It was serious. The horses had reacted, the guards remained in control, and the foolish tourist had been reminded that some places were not meant for jokes. The lesson was not complete yet, but the fear in their eyes showed they were finally beginning to learn. The uneasy silence in the square was suddenly broken by a deep, commanding voice. One of the royal guards, who had been standing perfectly still all this time, suddenly called out with a sharp warning. His words echoed across the space like a drumbeat, clear and powerful, leaving no doubt that it was an order, not a request. The sound startled the foolish tourists, and even the horses stilled for a moment as though reassured by their rider's control. The crowd gasped, for it was rare to hear a guard speak. Their reputation was built on silence, on discipline, and on never breaking their stillness unless absolutely necessary. The fact that one had spoken meant the tourists had crossed a serious line. Parents whispered to their children about the importance of respect, while phones continued to record the unfolding scene. What had started as a childish act was now becoming a public lesson. The tourists froze in place. Their earlier laughter vanished completely. The man with the red scarf swallowed hard, his face pale. The woman with the big hat lowered her head, hiding her eyes. They looked around nervously, realizing for the first time that the crowd was not on their side. Instead of laughing with them, hundreds of eyes were glaring at them with disappointment and anger. One guard's warning was enough to change the atmosphere entirely. The tourists no longer looked like brave adventurers. They looked like misbehaving children who had been caught. The crowd's cameras did not miss a single detail. Every flinch, every tremble, every nervous glance was recorded for the world to see. The horses shifted again, still restless but controlled by their riders. The guards kept their grip firm, their posture strong. Their silence after the warning felt even heavier, like a reminder that the group's behavior had been unacceptable. The air was filled with shame, though it belonged only to the foolish visitors. One of the women in the group whispered that they should leave. She tugged on her friend's sleeve, urging him to step back. But another man, perhaps out of pride, muttered that they should stay calm and act like nothing was wrong. His voice shook, betraying his fear, and his words sounded weak even to his own friends. The truth was clear. None of them had the courage to continue. The crowd began to murmur again. Some people laughed quietly, but it was not the laughter of amusement. It was the laughter of disbelief at how foolish the group had been. Others spoke softly about how they deserved whatever embarrassment came their way. A few shook their heads in disgust, muttering about how tourists sometimes forgot that respect was not optional. The group could feel the weight of every eye on them. Their earlier joy had turned into humiliation. They had wanted attention, but not this kind of attention. Instead of being admired, they were being judged. Instead of being seen as brave, they were seen as foolish. And worst of all, they could not escape the cameras. Every step, every expression, every mistake was being filmed by strangers who would surely share it beyond the square. The man with the phone finally lowered his device completely, slipping it into his pocket. His hands shook and his eyes darted nervously toward the guards. He whispered that they should leave quickly before things grew worse. The woman with the hat agreed, nodding furiously. She held on to her friend's arm for support as they slowly stepped back from the gate. But as they moved, the horses reacted once more. One of them tossed its head, letting out a loud snort that echoed in the air. The group flinched, stumbling back more quickly now, their retreat clumsy and awkward. One of them nearly tripped over his own feet, catching himself just before falling. The crowd gasped and then laughed softly, not out of cruelty but out of the simple irony of seeing arrogance crumble so quickly. The guards remained statuesque, their faces blank, their discipline perfect. But their very stillness made the group's clumsy movements look even worse. The comparison was clear. One side was strength and dignity, the other was weakness and shame. A man in the crowd called out that they should have listened to the signs. His voice carried, and several people nodded in agreement. The group's faces flushed red with embarrassment. They lowered their eyes, trying not to meet the gaze of anyone around them. Their earlier boldness was gone, replaced by silence and regret. As they stepped back farther, the crowd parted slightly, creating a path for them to leave. But this path felt less like an exit and more like a walk of shame. Every step they took was watched, every movement recorded. The square had turned into a stage, and they were no longer performers but examples. Examples of what happens when arrogance replaces respect. The horses settled slightly now, sensing that the disturbance was moving away. They stood tall and strong, their ears forward again, their breath steady. Their discipline matched their riders, and together they looked like symbols of power and tradition. The crowd admired them, their respect growing deeper after witnessing how they handled the foolishness of a few. The tourists, on the other hand, moved like shadows. Their shoulders were hunched, their steps quick, their faces hidden. They no longer spoke loudly, no longer laughed. Instead, they whispered nervously among themselves, wondering how much of their shame had been caught on camera. The answer, of course, was all of it. Children tugged at their parents, asking why the group had acted that way. Parents explained softly that some people forget how to behave when they are excited, but that such behavior is never right. The lesson was being shared not only with the group, but with everyone who had watched. Respect was not just about following rules. It was about understanding the meaning behind them. The group finally reached the edge of the square, but even there, the crowd's eyes followed them. A few members of the group tried to straighten their backs to act as though they were leaving by choice. But their red faces told the truth. They had not chosen to leave with pride. They had been pushed out by their own foolishness and the strength of tradition they had ignored. The palace returned to calm. The guards stood still, their silence restored. The horses stood tall, their dignity unbroken. The crowd settled again, though the murmurs of what had happened continued. People spoke about it in different languages, their voices carrying the same message. Those tourists had gone too far, and they had paid the price in shame. Far from the gates, the group of tourists stopped for a moment, breathing heavily. Their laughter was gone, replaced by silence. They looked at each other, unsure what to say. No one wanted to admit they had been wrong, but the truth hung heavy in the air between them. They had been foolish, and they knew it. Their day in London had not given them the proud memory they wanted. Instead, it had given them a lesson they would never forget. And behind them, the palace stood strong, guarded by soldiers and horses who had shown once again that dignity could not be mocked without consequence. The group of tourists walked quickly away from the palace square, their footsteps hurried, their shoulders heavy with shame. None of them laughed now. The air around them felt colder than before, though the sun was still shining brightly over London. They had come to the gates expecting fun, expecting stories to brag about when they returned home. Instead, they carried the weight of humiliation that burned on their faces and echoed in their hearts. Behind them, the crowd slowly returned to its quiet admiration of the guards. Parents explained once again to their children why respect was important. People whispered to each other about how foolishness had been punished without anyone having to lift a hand. The guards had not moved except to give one warning, yet that one warning was enough to change everything. The horses had not harmed anyone, but their powerful reactions had shown that they were not to be mocked. The square felt calm again, but the lesson lingered like an invisible shadow. The tourists kept glancing back over their shoulders as they walked farther away. They could still see the tops of the guards' tall black hats above the crowd, standing firm like monuments of history. Every time they looked back, their shame grew stronger. They knew that people would not remember them as brave travelers. They would remember them as the ones who ignored the signs, the ones who laughed too loudly, the ones who disrespected tradition and were forced to retreat in disgrace. One of the men finally broke the silence. He muttered that it was not such a big deal, that everyone was just overreacting. But his voice was weak, his tone unconvincing. None of his friends agreed with him. The woman with the large hat pulled her hat lower over her face, wishing she could disappear. The man with the red scarf shook his head, saying nothing. He knew in his heart that they had gone too far, and his pride had turned into regret. As they passed by shop windows, they noticed their reflections. They did not look like the happy group that had arrived full of excitement. They looked tired, embarrassed, and small. Their energy was gone. Every time they caught the reflection of their faces, they saw their own mistakes staring back at them. And deep inside, they wished they could take back their foolishness. What they did not realize yet was that their shame was no longer private. Many people had filmed them. Already, videos were being shared on phones, spreading across social media. Clips of their clapping, their shouting, their foolish poses. And finally, their retreat were being uploaded and watched by people far beyond the palace square. Strangers who had never set foot in London were already shaking their heads at the group's behavior. The world was bigger than they had imagined, and their shame was growing larger with every passing minute. The group stopped at a quiet corner near a small cafe. They sat down at an outdoor table, none of them ordering food. They were too unsettled to eat. The woman with the hat took off her hat and placed it on the table, her hands trembling slightly. "I thought it was just fun," she whispered, her voice breaking the silence. "I didn't mean to upset anyone." The man with the red scarf sighed deeply. He rubbed his forehead, his face pale. "We were warned," he said. "There were signs everywhere. People told us to stop. Even the officer tried to move us back. But we didn't listen. We thought it was all a joke. No one argued with him. The truth hung heavy between them. Their pride had blinded them, and their laughter had turned into something ugly. They had thought they were making memories, but what they had created was a lesson they would carry forever. The crowd at the palace moved on with the day. More tourists arrived, many of them respectful and quiet, admiring the guards from a safe distance, taking pictures without disturbing the animals. They watched with awe, not arrogance, and they walked away with smiles of respect instead of the red faces of shame. The foolish group, however, sat in silence, their day ruined by their own actions. Hours later, when they returned to their hotel, the reality of their behavior became even clearer. Their phones buzzed with messages. Friends from home had already seen the videos. Comments poured in, some expressing disbelief, others mocking them for their foolishness. Their faces were recognizable, their actions undeniable. They could not escape what they had done, and they could not erase what the world had seen. The man with the phone, who had filmed the entire event himself, now regretted every moment. He wished he had never raised his device, never pushed so close, never tried to make a game out of something serious. He deleted the pictures and videos from his own gallery, but it was too late. The recordings from strangers had already gone far beyond his control. That night, the group sat together in the hotel lounge. They spoke quietly, their voices low, their words heavy. "We should never have done it," one of them admitted. "We treated something sacred like a stage show. Those guards were doing their duty. Those horses were trained and respected. And we made fools of ourselves," the others nodded. Their earlier arrogance was gone, replaced by reflection. They realized that respect was not just a word written on a sign. It was a value, a responsibility, something that every visitor owed to places of tradition and dignity. Their laughter had not been clever. It had been cruel. And their punishment had not come in the form of force, but in the form of public shame. In the days that followed, they avoided speaking about the palace whenever they visited other parts of London. They admired the Tower of London. They walked across the famous bridges, they visited museums. But no matter where they went, the memory of that day stayed with them. It followed them like a shadow, a constant reminder of the mistake they had made. When their trip finally ended and they returned home, the story came with them. Friends asked about London, and they smiled politely, speaking about the food, the buildings, the history. But inside, they remembered only the palace square, the guards, the horses, and the moment when their foolish laughter turned into silence. They did not share that story with pride. They carried it as a private lesson. For the rest of their lives, the memory stayed clear. Whenever they saw a picture of a royal guard, whenever they watched a video of the palace, the shame came back. They remembered the warning signs, the stillness of the guards, the power of the horses, and the heavy silence of the crowd. They remembered how small they had felt when the guard's voice finally broke the air. In time, they accepted it as a lesson that had been necessary. They had learned respect the hard way. They had learned that not everything was meant for amusement, and that arrogance could lead to regret faster than anything else. They had learned that tradition and discipline deserved silence, not laughter. The royal guards continued their duty day after day, standing tall at the palace gates. Their horses continued their work, strong and dignified, symbols of a history that could not be mocked. Thousands of visitors came and went, many of them respectful, some careless, but none forgetting the sight of the guards' discipline. The foolish tourists became just one story among many, but their story carried meaning. It showed what happens when respect is forgotten. It showed how quickly arrogance can turn into embarrassment. And it showed that the dignity of tradition is stronger than the foolishness of pride. In the end, they were grateful in a quiet way that nothing worse had happened. No one had been harmed. The guards had not needed to act with force. The horses had not been pushed too far. Instead, the group had been given a punishment that would last far longer than a moment of pain. They had been given the memory of shame, a lesson that would follow them forever. And so their trip to London did not give them the proud tale they had wanted. But it gave them something else, a reminder that respect is not optional, and that those who forget it will always regret it.